who is joining this webinar, which EFAMA is hosting in support of the 2022 IOSCO World Investor Week. The title of the session is Sustainable Finance Literacy, the Next Challenge for Investor Education. So my name is Natalie Westerbarki. I'm the head of EU Public Policy at Fidelity International, and I have the great honor to be moderating the session in my role as chair of the EFAMA Investor Education Platform. So to let everyone know, this session will be recorded, and you're of course very welcome to ask any questions you may have in between by submitting your question in the Q&A box, in the chat box of this WebEx application. And I will then read them out and hopefully be able to ask the presenters after their sessions, and so we can make it an interactive session today. In terms of the agenda, so the webinar is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, we will have a 10-minute presentation on MiFID II by Carolina Di Giorgi, who is EFAMA Regulatory Policy Advisor. In the second part, we will have a 10-minute presentation on an academic study on sustainability financial literacy by Tobias Weghoff, who is researcher at the Center of Economic Research at ETH Zurich of University of Zurich. And in the third part, we will have a very hopefully interactive panel discussion and again opportunity for Q&A. What can be done to bridge the sustainable finance literacy gap? The panel will be moderated by Ms. Denise Voss and joined by 5 excellent panel speakers, which Denise will introduce in greater detail as soon as we turn to the panel conversation on part 3. So allow me now, without further ado, to give the floor to Carolina Di Giorgi for the presentation on MiFID II. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thanks everyone. While I'm downloading the, let me just check. So first of all, one of the trends that we are seeing right now is that regardless of their actual level of knowledge of ESG concepts, you investors do want their money to have an impact, and the rules are adapting to accommodate this trend. So the big game changer in the European Union is the introduction of sustainability preferences as part of the suitability assessment, and the set of rules that governs this process is the updated MiFID delegated regulation, which applies from the 2nd of August. And let's see how it works in practice. So first of all, in the hierarchy of consideration, the firms will start by analyzing the client knowledge, experience, financial situation, investment objectives, so business as usual so far. But then the advisor will ask if the client has any sustainability preference by way of a yes or no question. And if the answer is yes, the firm is to assess if this preference is with regards to one or more of the aspects that you see on the screen, which are minimum proportion of EU taxonomy alignment, with taxonomy being a classification of sustainable economic activities by 6 environmental targets, a minimum proportion of sustainable investment under SFDR, and SFDR is a regulation that imposes a set of ESG disclosure requirements to financial market participants, or finally, a considered principal adverse impact, and there is a list of indicators proposed by SFDR. This concept wants to capture any negative effect that an investment may have on society or on the environment, such as an increase in carbon footprint, for instance. And all of these aspects sound pretty much exotic, and they're indeed quite hard to understand, which means that distributors should be able at least to explain them in a simple manner. And we also have 3 special cases. The case number 1 is where the client has no sustainability preference, which also applies to clients who haven't updated their profile yet. In this case, the client is deemed as sustainability neutral and can be recommended both products with or without sustainability-related features. Second case is when the firm cannot meet the client's sustainability preference, meaning that there is a mismatch between the client's expectation and the real offering of the firm. In this case, no recommendation can be made, and the firm can only disclose its actual offering of products with sustainability-related features after the client has expressed the intention to change their original preferences, and only once they've been changed, the firm can recommend a product that matches the now revised preferences. The case number 3, possibly the most interesting one, is when the client is unable to define its specific preference. And this situation is highly interconnected with low sustainable finance literacy and with the fact that investors are, especially retail investors, are rarely familiar with these risk-free options. And in this case, the firm will recommend the product that better matches the client's generic preference. But moving on to the status of implementation of this new obligation, we start by saying that we as EFAMA, we surveyed our members and more specifically our national association, and they're sharing the result of this exercise. So first of all, the regulation does apply in all EU member states as of the 2nd of August, which means that local NCAs have not officially provided leniency or forbearance to distributors or manufacturers. We are only aware of one small exception with the NCA of a member state that clarified in a letter that the implementation of these new requirements will not be a priority in the supervisory authority activities, but still that the rules should nevertheless apply on a best effort basis. And these rules are a big change. And indeed, before them, only 1 out of 4 advisors in the EU asked about ESG preferences as part of the profile assessment. And this figure actually comes from a survey made by 2 Degrees Investing, and we will hear from Stan Dupré later in the panel about this. And given these brand new rules and the absence of ESMA guidelines by the times they were introduced, at least, our members reported having received little guidance from the NCAs. But however, some local regulators have issued generic clarification or even held some public hearings. And we also know that the final EIOPA and ESMA suitability guidelines have contributed to adding some flexibility in the collection of sustainability preferences. So against all of this background, there is still some complexity involved in this process. And the main challenges probably relate to the lack of ESG data, which is only progressively becoming available, and the absence of a clear definition of what is a sustainable investment. And this goes on top of low financial literacy, which is the focus of our upcoming presentation and discussions. So focusing now on 4 points, just please be mindful that we do not have official data, and this is still early information, of course. So let us start with talking about the training. So the industry has been providing relevant training to upskill their employees. And in particular, the most distributors say that they have been providing ESG-related training to their advisor for some time now. In terms of how the training is carried out, many firms report having had in-person sessions. Some even held roundtables. But at this stage, this remains something very firm-specific. We also see that the industry is relying a lot on the European ESG template, which is an exceptionally useful, if not the #1 tool for manufacturers at the moment to report on sustainability preferences options across their products and for advisors to help them filter out relevant products. And all of this preparation has involved significant time and resources, but this will remain an ongoing, I want to say, learning process, which means that more and more training opportunities will need to be held. And moving on to the explanations to the client, as far as we know, advisors are taking a non-complex approach, raising simple questions, providing, as far as possible, simple explanation, sometimes, for instance, indicating where more technical information will be found in the documents. But more broadly, there is not, or at least we don't see it yet, a dominant pattern in the way of collecting information within or across member states. And this is mostly because this process depends heavily on the internal training of the advisor, which tends to be adapted to the average client base of the individual distributors. And we also know that regardless of improvements in the way these are presented, these concepts remain quite complex to assimilate, especially since the regulatory landscape is evolving continuously, which means that financial literacy initiatives are very much needed. Moving on to product offer, we see that because of the current data gaps, at this stage, investors are likely to be presented with a limited choice of funds, mostly related to one of these 3 selections, which is sustainable investment under CFTR. And while manufacturer distribution and distributors are expanding their offer of sustainable products pretty much everywhere in the European Union, we also see that the range of available sustainable products currently offered varies by country. And this is especially true for domestic funds, with some markets having just a few Article 8 or even less Article 9 funds. And these denominations respectively indicate light green and dark green funds. So for instance, we have some countries that reporting having launched their very first Article 9 funds, domestic funds, just a few months before the entry into force of these new rules, whereas in other markets, distributors are already able to offer a wide range of green products as they started producing them a longer time ago. And in particular, in those countries where the product offer of ESG-related ambition is still scarce, the logic remains to suggest to the client to adapt their preferences. And the reason for this is still unclear regulation and the risk of greenwashing, which sometimes may lead to the opposite issue, which is green bleaching. So for instance, one of the things that we saw is that some firms are being very conservative regarding, for instance, taxonomy alignment for Article 8 products, stating 0%. And finally, this new obligation will lead distributors to rely more and more on ESG ratings, for instance, to find the best Article 8, best Article 9 funds. But there are still some shortcomings in the ESG rating market, such as the different rating methodologies that need to be addressed. And just last but not least, on clients' preferences, we will start by seeing an interesting and seemingly counterintuitive finding. So some of our members, such as from the Nordic countries or from Central Europe, actually reported that a rather large share of retail clients declare not having sustainability preferences at all. And one of the possible reasons is that financial return remains a key consideration for investors, and the evidence is still unconclusive on the financial performance of some of these products with sustainability-related characteristics. More broadly, given the war and the current geopolitical setup, we see that the clients seem to be hesitant to invest, and that ESG features are probably at this stage not a big enough yet incentive for them to do so. As a second point, it appears that a very big part of those clients who want to invest responsibly are not able to specify a preference with regards to these three aspects, which is exactly the special case that we discussed earlier, the special case number 3. And of course, this is especially problematic because manufacturers and distributors rely on testing clients' appetite, possibly for specific ESG features, in order to best adapt their offer. So to conclude, what we see is that we are still in the early days of the new rules being implemented. The policymakers and the industry are working hard, but improvements are needed. And importantly, we see that investors are facing a complex, possibly confusing set of criteria when evaluating the E, the S, and the G of a product that they may want to invest in. And in order to make informed decisions in this very context, basic financial literacy may not be sufficient, and investors might strongly benefit from sustainability-specific financial knowledge. That being said, ESG offers huge opportunities of growth. The product offer is greatly on the rise. The regulatory environment is making good progress, and things will improve as we get more data. So all of this tells us that there is an excellent momentum, not only to keep updating the rules, but also to change our way of thinking about investor education, which is why I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Tobias Wyckoff and from all of our panelists. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for this very succinct and on-time delivery of your presentation in exactly 10 minutes. So I just checked in the chat, in the WebEx chat box, there are no questions, but I do take note of what you said during your implementation, very interestingly, that it's done on a best effort basis at the national level. So, which doesn't sound like much legal certainty, but at the same time, it sounds like a bit of a legislative soft launch, and there could be a good reason for it. And I guess we will probably find out about that reason a bit more when we now listen to Tobias Wyckoff's presentation. So Tobias is a researcher at the Center of Economic Research of ETH Zurich, and he's actually going to present the results of the academic report, as you can see on his slide he just pulled up, and he's actually a co-author of this study. So without further ado, I hand over to Tobias to talk about the obstacles to overcome.
Thank you, Natalie. Many of you are probably familiar with this experience. You are in a foreign country where you do not know the language and you are lost. That's how retail investors often feel when they want to invest into sustainable products. By now, sustainable finance makes up to 50% of the inflow in EU investment products, but at the same time, there is no single definition that identifies an investment product as sustainable. And in this context, investors face a complex and confusing set of criteria, and the knowledge about sustainable investments becomes critical to making informed decisions. We call this type of knowledge sustainable finance literacy. In our study, we asked ourselves 3 research questions. First, what are the determinants? What is the level of sustainable finance literacy among retail investors in Switzerland? And second, what are the determinants of the level of knowledge? And third, is this knowledge, is sustainable finance literacy also a determinant for actually owning sustainable finance products? To analyze these questions, we organized a survey exactly 1 year ago with a bit more than 3,000 participants from the German-speaking part of Switzerland. A particularity of our sample was that we only had experienced retail investors. So in Switzerland, there is a voluntary pension scheme, the so-called third pillar, which is market-based and which is used by about 60% of the Swiss population. And by participating in this pension scheme, they have already some elementary contact with the financial market and with how to invest money. And we reached out to such experienced retail investors with a marketing company. Among many other questions, we also asked them to disclose if they own ESG products or sustainable investment products, which will be important for the next part of the analysis. But first, we asked a set of questions to assess the level of sustainable finance literacy. Here you can see the results of 8 multiple choice questions, and overall we see that the percentage of correct answers is quite low. For instance, only 26% of the respondents knew what E, S, and G actually stand for. Moreover, only 41% knew that the Swiss regulatory authority doesn't have a set of standards and rules that it enforces for ESG products, and only 12% were aware of labels that can certify ESG products, such as the F&G label, for instance. Then next, we went on to an example, a company that has a very good environmental footprint, but rather poor social practices with their employees. And we asked if such a company could be considered sustainable in the financial markets. And the correct answer is yes, but only 30% agreed with this statement. And next, only less than 5% of the respondents were aware that in order to be considered sustainable, only one of the 3 E, S, and G elements must be sustainable. Only one of them is necessary, and most thought that a company must be sustainable in all 3 of the elements. Then next, we asked if a sustainable investment has a direct and immediate impact on the real economy, which is probably not right because they are all traded on secondary markets, and hence the direct impact is not obvious. Only 47% of the sample were aware that mutual funds that invest into green stocks, that they do not exercise their voting rights consistently. And the last question was about impact investing, and only 20% knew that there was a difference between regular sustainable investments and impact investing. So we see here that the overall level is rather low when we have these multiple choice type questions, but we also went to ask a more general level of sustainable finance literacy that is maybe closer to what retail investors experience when they talk to their bank advisor. We asked an open-ended questions where respondents answered by writing a short text. So we asked the respondents to describe what is for them the difference between a regular financial product and a sustainable product. You can see here one of the example answers from a respondent. Sustainable financial products invest in companies or technologies that minimize environmental damage and unsocial conditions without being inefficient. So we see here there are many topics that occur with technologies, the environment, social, also financial sustainability with the efficiencies mentioned. So there are many topics, and in our paper we developed a method based on artificial intelligence to classify and to identify these topics automatically in the answers. In a nutshell, it's based on identifying certain keywords. For instance, the topic environment is associated with the keywords renewable, CO2, environment, similar for social. And on the right-hand panel, you can see the results, how often these topics were mentioned. We see that the by far most important topic is environment, followed by social, and the other topics, they are around 10%. Governance is even less. So for most of the retail investors, sustainable investment is mostly about saving the environment and doing something good for the environment, to a lesser extent social. The other topics, they are not so important to these to the retail investors, at least they are not aware of them. To have a quantitative score, one number for the level of this knowledge, what we did was to count how many of these topics our respondents mentioned. And this leads us to the distribution of these literacy scores. The left panel is the financial literacy, which is the general knowledge about investments. And there we see that the score is very high. This is not surprising because we only interviewed experienced retail investors that have a high level of financial literacy. In the middle, there's the sustainable finance literacy based on these 8 multiple choice questions. We see that the mean is somewhere between 2 and 3 out of 8, which is rather low. And there are very few respondents that have many correct answers and high scores. And for this general measure based on the text, it is similar, but the level of knowledge is even lower, with the mean between 1 and 2, and even less respondents have a high level. And this leads to the next point. What are the key determinants of sustainable finance literacy? So are there patterns among the respondents that can explain a high score? The strongest effect was the level of education. So if respondents had a high level of education, such as attending the university, they were very high in both of the scores. For other variables, the effect is more differentiated. For instance, older respondents have a lower score of sustainable finance literacy, but when it comes to this open question, which is like talking to someone, there's no impact. The same goes for wealth, where more wealthy people tend to have a higher score of literacy, but not for the open-ended question, the more general knowledge. The most striking difference was the gender. We observed that women score significantly lower in sustainable finance literacy than men, but this difference disappears when we ask the same concept with an open-ended question. And these findings that there are some variables actually do not have an impact, if you ask a bit differently, they are important for the policy targeting if we were to come up with educational measures to increase the knowledge. Because we could say that everybody has a rather homogeneously low level of literacy. Then there were some other variables in our data set that didn't have an impact on any of the scores, such as altruism or household size. The last point is, how does this level of sustainable finance literacy connect to actually owning sustainable finance products? And we found that the ownership of these products is strongly associated with the level of both of these literacy measures. Respondents with a high score in either of the literacy measures tend to hold sustainable finance products more frequently. And even more so, both of these measures are actually complementary. The highest probability of owning sustainable assets occurred when both sustainable finance literacy scores were high among a respondent. And based on that, we have the following policy recommendations. So we found that the sustainable finance literacy is very low among Swiss retail investors. And that's a staggering result because these investors tend to have a high level of financial literacy. Low levels of sustainable finance literacy are associated with investing less into sustainable assets. The targeting of educational measures can be gender or income neutral because we suggest that the literacy level may be homogeneous and very low among the population. And lastly, improving sustainable finance literacy could also increase retail investors' demand for these sustainable finance products. And this leads to the next question: how can sustainable finance literacy actually be improved? So how can we enable investors to find their way among the many sustainable options? And that's also what the next topic in this webinar will be about. The following panel discussion will talk about how to actually improve sustainable finance literacy. And if you'd like to know more about the research that I presented, on the left-hand side, there's a link to a 3-page policy brief, and the right link is to the academic working paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for this very insightful presentation on the situation at the retail investor side. So we have now, you highlighted very well how there is a lack of financial sustainability literacy on the retail side. And Carolina highlighted how on the supply side, advisors and distributors are struggling with the implementation of asking about the new sustainability preferences on the supply side. So we have demand and supply. For both of them, this is new. And the big question is now, how can we achieve that the retail investors can better express their ESG and sustainable finance preferences? And how can also on the distribution side, advisors become more knowledgeable? And in order to overcome these obstacles, I'm now very excited to introduce the third part of our webinar session today, the panel discussion. So what can be done to bridge this sustainable finance gap is the big question. And I'm very thrilled to introduce Denise Voss, who will be moderating this panel session. She is the chairwoman of Lux Flag, and she's also the vice chair of the EFAMA Investor Education Platform. So I give the floor to Denise Voss.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you to Carolina and Tobias. Those were excellent presentations and lots of food for thought for our panel discussion. So it's really a thrill to be back again, participating on behalf of EFAMA in the World Investor Week. As many of you will know, EFAMA has for many years been focusing on financial literacy and investor education. And very thrilled also that the level of awareness of financial education and investor education at the EU policymaker level has increased quite a lot over the years. And now, of course, we have an even more challenging issue with adding sustainable finance to the mix. So I'm very pleased. I think we have a lot to talk about. We have a number of great panelists, and so I would like to go right ahead and introduce them. First up is Bianca Isenku, who is a policy analyst in the Consumer Finance, Insurance and Pensions Division at the OECD, working on financial education, technical assistance projects, and financial inclusion. Of course, just to say, I could actually spend a lot of time introducing all of our panelists, but I will keep it short, given how experienced they all are. Next up is Gianluca Manca, who represents the European Banking Federation at the Ecolabel Board and at the EFRAG Project Task Force for the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Long history in working in sustainable finance as well. Harold Walcate, is the founder, Finding Ways Ahead, and brings 25 years of experience to the table to identify evidence-based ESG approaches that work. Stan Dupre is the founder of 2 Degree Investing Initiative, and his think tank sheds light on the mismatch between retail investors' sustainability goals and sustainability assessments conducted across Europe. And as a member of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, Stan prepared the recommendations that led to the related MiFID II delegated action that we heard about. And last but definitely not least, someone well known by the EFAMA crowd, I would say, is Jarkko Sirela, who has 30 years of experience as a regulator and market participant in the European asset management industry, and currently he advises Nordea's senior management on challenges and opportunities caused by EU policy and regulation with a specific focus on asset and wealth management. And I know he's a big fan and supporter of investor education. So thank you. Thank you to you all. So off we go. The first part of our panel will talk about sustainable finance in the context of the Capital Markets Union, or CMU. So we all know that retail participation in the capital markets remains very low in Europe, despite the ongoing Capital Markets Union agenda. There are many reasons for this. Many people are risk adverse, of course, and prefer keeping their savings in bank deposits, especially given now rising interest rates. Limited levels of financial literacy in most countries prevents people from engaging with capital markets and understanding the benefits of investing. And then sustainable investment with its complexity adds to that challenge. So we may wonder if sustainable finance can actually achieve its goals if too many Europeans continue to keep their money in the bank versus investing in investment products. On the other hand, retail investors are quite and increasingly concerned by sustainability issues and very interested, many of them, in how their investments can contribute to a solution. And I'd say particularly the younger generation. It's therefore, I think, possible that these concerns will encourage people to invest in ESG investment products and help make progress at the same time towards the goal of the Capital Markets Union. So to kick off the discussion, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to briefly give us their thoughts on sustainable finance in the context of the Capital Markets Union. And I suggest we start with Bianca. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise, and hi to everyone. I'm having some issues with the internet, so if my voice breaks down, just make a sign, please, so I know that everything is fine. So yeah, it's a very challenging and also very interesting topic that we're going to discuss today. And I will maybe start with giving you a little bit of a, let's say, not good news compared to what we heard from Tobias earlier, who told us that the people in his sample had a very high level of financial literacy. What we find at the OECD is that, unfortunately, the financial literacy levels of people around the world is actually quite low. I think many of you know that we, the OECD, are measuring financial literacy and financial inclusion level for many years. And our latest data set, which is from just before COVID, based on a sample from 26 countries, of which 12 OECD members, it tells us that on average, individuals score around 60% of a maximum financial literacy score, where this score is really calculated on basic understanding, knowledge, concepts, and behaviors related to financial literacy. So it's not great. And if we look more in depth into concepts that are related, for example, to savings and investment, we see that across the sample, in general, there's a high understanding of risk and return, with a few exceptions. So we see that over 3/4 of respondents understand this concept, but very few actually understand the concept of risk diversification and the concept of interest compounding. Just less than a third of people in the sample understand actually what interest compounding is. And of course, these are concepts that are important for long-term savings and for investment as well. So this is obviously has an impact more broadly that I'm going to talk about. And actually a little bit in contrast again with what Tobias mentioned before in terms of gender. Here I want to bring some data from the PISA financial literacy assessment on financial literacy, which actually tells us that in terms of investment terms, young people are the least have the lowest familiarity with these terms, and this is especially there's especially a big gap when it comes to understanding of this concept by girls. So there is a gender gap that is formed already there. We also see actually something similar to Tobias' research, that financial inclusion is higher amongst those that have higher financial knowledge. Obviously, this doesn't imply causality, but it illustrates, you know, a link between financial inclusion and financial knowledge. So would it be that if financial literacy increases, financial inclusion may increase? There's an association there for sure. And we also see that in general, like we've also said before, just only about half of the respondents in the OECD countries report having any sort of savings, investment, or retirement products. Now, these kind of products obviously are among the most complex ones that the consumers need to deal with. And obviously there's always, like we know already, behavioral biases that affect consumers when it comes to their participation in the capital markets. And at the same time, like we've seen again and again, the consumers are actually shifting their general purchasing powers towards more greener, sustainable options, and also express interest in making financial decisions that consider these issues. And we see that especially with the young people that have a higher preference for sustainable investments, while at the same time, our surveys show that they have the lowest levels of financial literacy. So to come to your question, we think that there's potential. It has potential. This new interest is positive. It may steer interest in the capital markets among the group of consumers that have so far not been engaged with investing, but it definitely raises concerns given the additional complexities that sustainable investing or sustainable investments entail, given the general level of low financial literacy, and given the fact that investors that don't have, or new investors that don't have experience, are attracted to the markets by these types of investment. So we think that this needs to be carefully managed and monitored. And we see risks to consumers that are especially linked to the greenwashing and mis-selling of products. But I think we will have to also, we'll have the chance to discuss this a little bit more in detail. So yes, but with, you know, the careful considerations that I just mentioned of the risks.
Thank you, Bianca. Harold, could I ask you to contribute? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm just going to agree here with Bianca, so I can keep it short. I think, yeah, there certainly seems to be an opportunity here. Obviously, sustainability and climate issues resonate with consumers, and so if we think that there's a need for consumers to do more investing generally, then sustainability can perhaps be a theme that can persuade them. At the same time, we should approach this with a lot of caution, because I think, and we'll get into all of this, I think, later on in the discussion, but I think we have to first have a very clear view on what we expect sustainable finance products that are suitable for consumers, for retail clients, to actually contribute to the bigger picture. I mean, we really have to understand the problems that we're trying to solve, and we have to understand, where does the money need to come from? Can sort of consumer retail money make a significant contribution here? And the other thing I think we have to be very careful about is the concept of additionality or causality. And again, I think we'll get into the detail in the rest of the session, but most consumers will have the sort of assumption that we're talking about some sort of causality when we're talking about sustainable funds or ESG funds. And even though this has not been researched very specifically, it does, you know, the research that is out there suggests that this is the case. And so again, we have to approach it with caution, because often there isn't, in fact, sort of this causality or additionality. So as Bianca says, you know, we don't want to disappoint people later or mislead them just with a view to getting them to invest more. And so again, something we can explore, but let's approach it with caution.
So you're right, it's very much about expectations, isn't it? And raising expectations, and in a topic that can be extremely emotional, right? Stan, you're up. Thank you.
Yes, so I tend to agree as well with these conclusions. I think the idea of like leveraging the interest of retail investors in sustainable finance to boost like capital market products, I think comes with a number of challenges. So the first one is that there's this correlation between high financial literacy, high financial sustainable literacy, and so I think this limit kind of the potential. the other aspect is like if you like focus on the non-literate customer, they will tend to just leave their money on deposits, and we see offer in this space of green deposits that are kind of are promoted with this idea that like you can save the planet every day using your debit card, which I think comes with a lot of caveats in terms of actual impact, but are pretty successful from a marketing perspective. And on the other end of the risk spectrum, you have like new type of digital assets, like a crowd investing, for instance, that are quite successful in creating an emotional connection with the customers and investors. And so that's another competition from the other end of the spectrum. And I think in between you have like kind of ETFs, like various capital market products, where the kind of hands-off packaged offer is a bit struggling to create an emotional connection with the clients. And at the same time, there's this problem of the inability to show impact in the real economy. So I think there's a kind of like difficulty, and it will probably require a lot of innovation to really create a space to attract new consumer with these products. There's a lot of relabeling, kind of packaging of products that are like kind of shift existing clients from standard products to sustainable products, but really to kind of increase the investment on capital markets, I think through sustainable finance is a challenge related to what I just mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Stan. Yeah, there's lots to do, and it's all happening at light speed, basically. And it is very much about trust as well, and understanding. I don't know if Jarkko or Gianluca, you would like to contribute something at this point?
Sure. I see I'm online. Okay. Well, I cannot but be totally in line with what Bianca, Harald, and Stan said before. On that, I'd like very briefly to add one thing. If we're looking at the transition of money that go from the deposit into invested products, then we have one new threat right today. You see the interest rates are rising now. So people are much more encouraged to sit on the yield provided by the deposit tool, rather than just experiencing the equity investing on the other side. That is the most direct way, together with the green bond, to be active and impacting also the world around. As a general comment on this point, specifically on sustainability wording, which I believe is one of the caveats why people do not flow in that direction, please consider that it's quite some times that practitioners and insiders have debated and scrutinized terms and definitions. And Tobias, I think, showed it before in his presentation. And there are still clouds to be scattered for the insider themselves. So just an example, eligibility and alignment in the taxonomy regulation is just an example of how the debate still goes on, and insiders and the practitioners are not really certain of what to use and when to use it and how in legislative terms. So this is one of the bridges we need to pursue in order to go on the other side and let everybody digest what is going on in simple terms, because the reality, the truth is simple. We need to make better choices for our own health and for the place where we live. How we do that, we as a species, we are very good at complicating things. And I can say that this action plan is beautiful and very complex. And right now, because of the fact that it's at its early stages, maybe it's not there yet for the whole population to understand what we're working on. But simplicity of wording, I believe it's the key.
Yeah, and we will talk about that a little bit later as well, in terms of common definitions and all the hard work that is needed in that direction. Jarkko, before we head on to the next topic, would you like to contribute?
Thanks, Denise, and very much agree with other speakers and also Gianluca just before me. But I want to have a bit of a go on the Capital Markets Union to start with. I mean, we've talked so many years about Capital Markets Union in Europe, and we are none the closer. The EU, we tend to have this belief that we can regulate everything. And we have tried to create this capital markets union by adding new regulations, new directives, amending others, and nothing is really happening. In my experience, 30 years in the market, I think what I see happening in various member states, when people start to invest more, I mean, it's of two reasons. It's either fiscal benefits, it's taxation, and it's then financial literacy. It's people understanding that they need to save more. And I think we have here two opportunities with ESG, and especially if people and younger generations start to understand that this is a good thing. Actually, they can save and invest and save the world. But this is not going to happen via regulation. And I think what we have now in the EU, I would offer Nobel Prize if there's anybody who can devise a more complex regime that we have created. I mean, would anybody believe in 4 years ago when we started this action plan that this is what we're going to end up with? And also on the MiFID rules that you can refer to taxonomy and PIEs and the belief that any retail investor actually can understand all that jargon, it's beyond me. So what we have now is that as managers, as distributors, we have to try and make some sense out of this, make it simple, as Jim Lucas was saying, make it simple enough so that actually when we talk to clients, we are not scaring them off with all this jargon and issues they are not able to understand, but make it simple, make a clear message, and hopefully that will help people to make decisions that actually benefit the cause. But really, I think I'm very unhappy with what we have in the regular framework. It's been done too hastily, and clearly, it has many faults. Of course, now we have to work on it and try to make it work. But clearly, I mean, that's going to happen in the field at the advisory process. That's going to be key. Thanks.
Thanks, Jarkko. Yeah, and of course, the element that's not helpful here is the urgency of the matter in terms of the climate crisis and the like. So lots to do. Yes, Dan?
If I can add a word, as you mentioned, I kind of recommended as a member of the high-level expert group of the Commission most of the pieces of regulation we discuss, and I kind of led the drafting of those recommendations, and I cannot agree more with this conclusion, which is like it's unbelievable how it's like complicated in a way that was not necessary. So I'm actually very frustrated with the outcome.
Okay, well, hope there's some policymakers out there listening, but it's a tough message to get across, I think. So I think it would be good to move on to our next topic, though, the low level of sustainable finance literacy. Obviously, one of the key points we're discussing here today. So leaving aside the goals of the Capital Markets Union, we need to consider ways, obviously, in which the level of sustainable finance literacy can be improved. And the need for that, of course, was very clear from the presentations we heard earlier. So for this very reason, EFAMA ran a survey to gather views of its members on some measures that could be taken to bridge the sustainable finance literacy gap by ranking specific measures between 1 and 10, 1 being low effectiveness and 10 being high effectiveness. There is a table that is being put on the screen, hopefully, where we can see the results of the survey based on the 53 answers received. Here we go. Okay, so in effect, we can see that there was no outstanding measure that was deemed to be hugely effective. They're all in a fairly wide, close range, if you will. No measure has received massive support, if you will. That being said, we can see that organization of training courses for financial advisors and distributors is deemed to be the highest effective measure by the organizations that answered, as well as organization of training courses for officials in national supervisory authorities, not to be forgotten. We need them to understand as well, of course, to be effective in their supervision duties. On the other hand, I think measures targeted at retail investors, a number of these, there was no consensus in particular on the effective of one of these measures versus the other. Relevant information about sustainable finance on television, on e-learning platforms, in key information documents, or during an EU ESG week, as was proposed. So Jarkko, would you like to comment on these results and perhaps suggest some other types of investor education initiatives with the aim of increasing sustainable finance literacy for retail investors?
Thank you, Denise. I think it's very interesting, and the results, to me, these are very clear, because it's very clear that the focus is on advice. So that's really what everybody sees, that, or most majority sees, that it's going to be key that the advisory staff, they have to understand, they are able to explain all this very complex stuff to the clients. So the focus should be really having very well trained advisors and distributors. That's key. And the other end of the spectrum, it's also very, very interesting, because it clearly shows that hardly anybody believes that by having some more wordings in the kids about these issues would help in any way. So I think everybody is frustrated with PRIPS kits and whatever. We've seen that we end up with dozens of pages of stuff that nobody reads. So that is not the answer. So advisory process is key. But also, I'm a bit laughing to ourselves here. Talk about TV and radio. Where's social media? Where's YouTube? I mean, if you want to reach the younger generations, it's enough to put some video clips on YouTube or Instagram or wherever. I'm not even aware what are the latest ones. So, I mean, those are the channels to really reach the younger generations. And I think it's happened in many countries during COVID crisis. We saw a lot of more retail investment and all these discussions about which stocks to invest in, and of course in the US we all know that got a bit too hot. But at least in the Nordics, there's been a lot of interest by younger generations in investment. And that's because of bloggers, there are many female, young female investors, for example, blogging about these issues, with tens of thousands of followers. So suddenly investment has become really interesting. But you need to go to the medias where these generations are, and that's not TV and radio even. That's social media. So I think most actually useful and cost efficient is to have some good stuff posted on YouTube on this, and hopefully people will find it. That can be in the short term much more effective than putting it in the school programs, which of course is a good thing, but will gain benefits only in years to come. So my advice is on advisors and then social media.
Mm-hmm. And I'll even posit to say that even old people use social media, so it's not just the young, but you're right, absolutely. Targeting the young with television ads just won't make the grade. But I would like to come back to the observation that participants in the survey, they didn't believe in these measures that we saw to inform people about, why and how to invest in financial products that promote environmental or social characteristics or invest in sustainable investments. Maybe it's because people are not interested in spending time reading materials, and goodness, as an industry, we have produced a lot of reading materials, haven't we? But it actually, it is unclear, of course, whether conventional investor education initiatives can be helpful, as conventional investor education initiatives are long-term projects that take many years to deliver tangible results. And I see, Gianluca, you have your hand up, but could I just give and Bianca, I wanted to give the floor to Bianca just to see if she, from the perspective of the OECD, agreed with that view that, the investor education conventional initiatives take a long time. Are you still optimistic about being able to get sustainable finance literacy up, if you will, to a level of such that people will invest in sustainable finance products? And then we'll go to you, Gianluca, after.
Thanks, Denise. Well, I wanted to first react to the list, actually, to do the table. And just as a reminder, as we said before, the sustainable finance issues are extremely complex. So to me, it's not surprising that financial advisors don't think that this can be taught on a pill, on TV, or on social media, because in my opinion, as a financial educator, it requires opportunities to explain concepts in depth through courses, seminars, you know. So I'm not surprised that this has not come, you know, as a top priority. And same, I actually agree with Jarkko on the teaching in schools. I think it's very useful, but again, one is takes a long time, and it's also very complex from an institutional point of view. You know, setting a course in schools, it requires a lot of effort, and just to introduce elements of financial education and school curricula to countries have taken years to do that. So yes, it's great on the long term, but when we look at the urgency of the challenge we're facing, it's maybe not the most effective solution now. Then answering to your question, I think, well, first of all, I think we should be careful to think that financial education is the solution to everything. And we should also be careful not to use financial education, you know, as a way to shift the responsibility of these important and very complex decisions on the consumer. I think that, and this is the position of the OECD, the financial education is one element, but of this trilogy, as we call it. But the other element is financial consumer protection, of course, financial inclusion, and in our view is also appropriate regulation that needs to be put in place to protect consumers. And we've also seen how complex these issues are, the lack of definition, the lack of you know, common understanding of what we mean by these terms means that obviously this makes things very complicated for consumers. And having said this, so with this context, of course, financial education, especially in this context, are extremely important. And as we've seen, and coming back to the first question that we discussed, we've seen that there is a limited financial literacy of the population overall, and that we need to ensure that there is general financial education programs, first of all, are continued. And I don't think they have to be too long or too complex, but they really need to aim at providing people with information so that they can understand and be able to take financial decisions. And there are many examples of financial education initiatives which aim to do this through a variety of channels. And I've mentioned this before, but behavioral insights also can be leveraged to make financial education more effective. And you mentioned, Denise, that, okay, people are not willing to read the longer materials, but financial education is not about that. It's not about making people excited about reading disclosures and you know, like the fine print. It's about basically making sure that people have this basic understanding of concepts so that they can take appropriate decisions. And to me, this starts with building the basic skills before dwelling into complex issues such as sustainable finance. So from financial education side, we know this works, especially in terms of impacting financial education impacts knowledge, but also behaviors, as long as it is designed appropriately to respond to the audience needs. We cannot have standardized approach. And we also know that low intensity interventions, for example, information provision via educational nudges or via TV, they are less effective than, for example, personalized interventions such as counseling, and obviously they are more effective. They're also more costly, and in a way they corroborate the results of your survey, which actually seem to support the suggestion that the training and the advice is one of the most impactful issues, or one of the most impactful interventions that you can have to support the retail investors. So this is in line with the evidence that we have from the financial education side.
And maybe if I could just one little quick follow-up question, Bianca, on that. I know the OECD is really supportive of national strategies for financial education, and I would imagine that could be a really useful vehicle for adding in the sustainable finance literacy element of it, obviously bringing all parties together, right? And focusing on specific projects,
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is a great question, Denise. And what we've seen actually also we work with a lot of countries on national strategies for financial education. Now we are, I think, over 70 countries around the world have. And we also have technical assistance projects where we help countries develop these national strategies. And we see that more and more countries incorporate targets related to increasing consumer awareness in relation to sustainability and sustainable finance in their national strategies, because these are also policies that support broader policies, on transition and so on. So this is a great way to actually bring together sustainability, let's say, literacy with financial education. So we are seeing this happening, and I think this, like you said, it's a great opportunity.
Fantastic, thank you. Gianluca, you raised your hand.
Thank you. Yeah, with the risk of sounding very easy, I couldn't agree more with Bianca when she talks about inclusivity. That is the first step, of course. And the other thing that I totally agree upon is about the keys. I mean, teaching to people how to read a key creates certainly a flow of information, not awareness, which is what we need today. And if I may go one step back to the survey that you conducted, I have a slightly different view than Jarkko, because I see that out of the, I'm not an expert in polls or surveys, but I see that in 53 answers, they're quite compressed in an environment where everybody wants everything, pretty much. So there are no lines that have been excluded or that received a low grade, which means that pretty much people would like to have the whole shebang. People need to just move around in this very complex scenario, as Stan said before, in a way that we need to find a compass to move around, and nobody has the perfect recipe. If there's one thing that I can say about how banks have worked up to now, I can tell that banks have already put in place, for instance, specific training modules to inform and educate the workforce, also with the aim of better transfer concept and opportunities to clients. But this kind of revolution might not be enough. That this is what we witness from our side. All in all, we're very much in favor of the reorganization of school programs, as you called it in your survey, which we believe it guarantees a drastic and eventually long-lasting outcome for in few years only. We've seen that, for instance, elementary and secondary school, when they became compulsory in countries, people all spoke the language in 5 to 7 years. The language was very crystallized in a small time span. So this is why we go in that direction, and we believe that we need awareness that stems from the information flows, not the other way around.
Okay, great, thank you. Harold.
Yeah, thanks. No, so I think Gianluca and Bianca make very good points, and but I also have a slightly different view on this. Maybe before I analyze the answers that were given, maybe first analyze the question, because it's basically the question is, how should we bridge the sustainable finance literacy gap? So that's actually very difficult to say. But so I think instead of asking how, or before asking how, I think first we should ask ourselves the question, like, why should we bridge the sustainable finance literacy gap? And I think there are two potential motivations here. One is that financial institutions might just like to sell more sustainable finance products to consumers. And so if that is the motivation, I think that is just something to keep in mind as we're looking at surveys like this, and like how much time and effort should we put into all this. Another motivation might be like, well, we want to solve the big problems in the world, and that requires money. And we think that money from consumers can also contribute to this. And so one way of actually achieving this is to bridge the sustainable finance literacy gap. So I think that's a conversation that we're basically not having. I think too often in settings like this, we're just kind of assuming we want more sustainable finance. We need more people investing in sustainable finance. How are we going to get there? So let's have more discussions about like, why do we actually want this? So that's on the question. On the answers, I think what's interesting is what's missing here, also referring back to earlier comments that were made here, especially from Stan, is policymakers, educating policymakers, that doesn't seem to be one of the options here. And
yeah. In addition
I
to the
think it's like
regulators.
supervisory authorities or
Yeah.
regulators,
I
which
agree.
is slightly different. I think policymakers
Yeah.
are the people writing the actual rules. So we were just talking about taxonomy and SFDR and all those sorts of things, and how this is just unnecessarily complex. So I think here in the Netherlands, we have this concept that's called Jip en Janneke taal. So maybe to explain, Jip and Janneke is a very well-known series of children's books about a little boy and a little girl. And then it's very simple. It's written for children like who are like 4 or 5 years old. Very simple language. And there's this concept in the world of sort of, policy, but also finance, where people say, look, you have to try to explain this in Jip and Janneke language. Keep it really, really, really simple. And so this is something that I very much believe in. And often people will say, like, well, but this is very complex issues. And, you can't expect people to write, to be able to actually express this in Jip and Janneke language. My experience is very, very different. I think it's actually Stan has been posting a lot of excellent stuff here in the chat section. A lot of great reports that also point this out. It's not that difficult to explain the concept of sort of like additionality to people. You can present a fund and say, look, it is sustainable in the sense that it's going to give you like a warm glow. You'll be sort of associated with investments in wind farms, but your investment itself is not going to create more wind farms or more solar panels. In that sense, it's not effective. People understand this very easily. So I would say let's try to use the simple language and let's try to also educate policymakers on these issues and not make everything so ridiculously complex.
Agree 100%. The policymaker education element as well. You're right. Stan, I know you have a great some great comments on advice. So I don't know if we have a question on advice. So I don't know if you want to talk about that now or.
Yeah, sure. I think
or later.
So we conducted actually mystery shopping visits with across Europe on advisors to understand to what extent they are trained, how they integrate sustainability in the suitability assessment test. And so the results were mixed. So there were huge differences between different countries, especially in terms of training. And what we've seen is that there were pretty much no question asked about the existing knowledge and level of awareness and experience of their clients. And I would say when they were like, so there were more questions about, do you have sustainability goals? But it's only like a question asked spontaneously in 5 to 50% of the cases, depending on the countries. And the other thing we've seen is that in many cases, there's no, like when they raise this, they express expectation in this, the product that is recommended doesn't necessarily match with the expectation of the client. I think this is something that is obvious as well in the guidance that is provided. And it becomes really tricky when the client has expectations in terms of real impact in the real economy. Because in these cases, I think in 98% of the cases, the advisors try to use argument to prove that there is an impact when there's actually no evidence of it. And only 2% of advisors acknowledge that there is no evidence, and like basically it's a little bit like flipping a coin to invest in the product they recommend in terms of impact. So I think there's a lot of work to do on this. And maybe I think the second idea that relates to what Harold was saying is that there's a big question about the objective, because it's quite simple for people to express what they want, but the products don't address what they want. And so you end up with a kind of like gibberish and like categories and stuff to try to match the two, where actually the two don't match, and that's it. And so you probably need, like in the asset management industry, probably need to come up with new products. And my understanding is, to a certain extent, the regulation is an attempt to kind of plug things that are not compatible with each other. And at the end of the day, it doesn't probably work. It won't work pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. No, I appreciate the comment, and I saw a lot of nodding heads. I mean, I think one of the challenges is the whole timing element as well. I mean, as we know, this last year we've been asset managers have been in the process of repurposing to say, you know, integrating ESG in their investment strategies, repurposing, trying to get on board and deal with these incredibly tight timelines, with not as much data as they need either from the companies that they invest in. So I'm hoping and optimistic for the future, but for the moment it is challenging. Let's face it. But I think if obviously we saw the results of the survey in terms of, you know, the need to ensure that financial advisors are trained, and clearly that unfortunately doesn't happen overnight. So we need to keep at it. But if you permit me, I would like to move on to regulation. So I know we are all anticipating this moment. And basically, you know, beyond obviously the initiatives we talked about, the investor education initiatives we talked about, you know, could more regulation or a change in regulation help? I think that I guess the question is, and we talked a little bit about it already, you know, are the goals of the EU Sustainable Investment Agenda clear? I mean, I think that what we often hear about is that we have the Paris Agreement, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we have all this money that's needed to be able to obviously achieve those goals and achieve what's in the Paris Climate Agreement. So on the one hand, and obviously people also are living a lot of natural disasters, if you will, and it's touching more and more, you know, more and more lives, if you will. So I think in some respects, it seems obvious that the goals of the EU Sustainable Investment Agenda are clear, but I guess the question is, have they been explained and expressed appropriately? So maybe Stan and Harold, I don't know who wants to go first. If you would like to comment on that, that would be
please.
Interesting for us to hear.
All right. Yes. No. Happy to take this one. Certainly one of my favorite topics. But so I think the way you frame it, Denise, is already very smart, because yes, clearly we have significant issues and challenges in the world. Climate certainly being the most significant, it seems, and obviously to solve all of those problems, money is needed. So I think that, so again, it's a topic that kind of gets mentioned, or, you know, people throw out all these giant figures, you know, the trillions that are needed, and then typically in these kinds of conversations, immediately people move to this question. It's like, okay, well, so we need sustainable finance. I think for me, that's a little bit too fast. So I think there's a couple of steps that we need to make before we get there. So first of all, if we look at sort of the world's to-do list, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a pretty detailed list of things that we actually want to do or want to achieve. So if you look beyond the nice colored boxes, there's a UN resolution that also came out in 2015 that actually writes, I think, you know, in a pretty accessible way, articulates what those particular goals are and how to break them down into all of sort of the sub-elements and what are the things that we actually need to put in place. So that's, I think, a really good starting point, that detail. But then if you look at that detail, you realize that actually there's a lot of stuff there that is probably not going to be able to attract, you know, corporate activity or investable activity. So it's the type of stuff where, you know, most programs that you need to put in place to address poverty or hunger, for example, basically like government programs. It's, you know, or education, for example. So if you need to build schools across Africa, for example, that, at least today, is probably not an activity that can be done in a very profitable way. So I think often in these conversations about sustainable finance, the assumption is like, oh, we have sustainable development goals, so corporations need to fix these problems. And we need to direct capital towards these corporations. I think actually in many cases, corporations cannot really play a role, at least not today. So that's something you really have to keep in mind. So you have to zoom in on the stuff where corporations can play a role, and where you can have some sort of profitable activity, which means that it's investable. But then the next question is it investable also for like consumers, for retail clients? You know, often if you think, for example, about climate change, this requires the rollout of green energy, renewable energy infrastructure across the developing world. So that's something that is typically very risky stuff, and that's not even something that many pension funds in the developed world invest in. I don't think we should expect sort of the average consumer to put their savings into these kinds of, you know, infrastructure assets, even if you could structure this in a way that it's investable for an individual consumer. Anyway, so there are all these questions I think we need to answer as kind of steps you need to go through before you get to this question. And so that is something, that is a role I think that regulation can also play or can help in. So that's something that I guess I'd like to see more of.
Okay, and then maybe if I could just ask Harold, I mean, to be honest, it's also, again, it's about expectations, right? And one of the challenges too is if I'm a retail investor and I want to help, I don't know, the climate crisis or what have you, I need to understand that, and it might seem obvious, but I need to understand that it doesn't happen overnight. So
Right.
I need to be, you know, willing to potentially hold my nose, you know, and invest in a company that has involved in fossil fuels, but is transitioning and has, you know, has clear plans with KPIs as to how they transition. So I think that's one of the challenges as well with the retail investors too, is to explain, is to make sure that we are, again, as the whole greenwashing thing is to make sure we're not over promising and we're being realistic with them too, and helping them to, you know, to understand that they're needed for this transition, if you will.
Yeah, certainly, and I absolutely agree. And also, I mean, it touches on a broader point, also not so much to do with regulation, but more with sort of government intervention. So if we're talking about climate change, I think too many conversations today are based on the assumption that the private sector or corporations will sort of steward the energy transition. And so that's where this idea comes from, for example, engaging with energy companies like, okay, we have to force oil companies to invest in renewable energy assets, for example. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because if you look at the history of innovation and earlier transitions, it's basically been the government or governments who have been able to trigger these sorts of, you know, transformational changes. And individual companies can do very little to influence this bigger system that they operate in. But I think actually here also, I think many consumers or individuals actually sort of understand this, maybe at a pretty basic level. But so the surveys or research I've seen, for example, on, you know, pension fund beneficiaries, if you ask them, you know, do you want your pension fund to invest in sort of, you know, controversial oil and gas companies? Actually, often people say, well, we will need oil and gas companies for the next 30 years or so, because the transition will take a long time. So I think many people sort of understand this maybe at a pretty basic level, but so I think that's also something that we should take into account.
And I guess the question is, how does that get translated into what their financial advisors are telling them? Do the advisors understand that? I mean, maybe, I mean, we have basically, we're going to look at three sort of semi subtopics about regulation. But before we do that, Stan, did you want to maybe add to?
Yeah, sure, I can. I think
talking about.
So that's a question we had with the, like, what Harold was just mentioning was something I tried to discuss with the Commission when we were elaborating the regulatory framework. And so this idea that it's not because you expose your portfolio to green stuff or reduce the exposure to brown stuff that it changes anything. It's like slightly more complex. Like, for instance, if you like invest in seed capital, even like a tiny part of your portfolio, you might make a difference. But if you invest in liquid market, probably not, because it doesn't change anything, because by design it's liquid. So this is the type of complexity that the Commission didn't want to get into this level of sophistication. And so at the end of the day, they introduced what I think is a dogmatic approach. So somehow the regulation helped address the problem of greenwashing, because they kind of set rules on, okay, this is what it means to be exposed to green or less exposed to brown stuff. So I think they did a kind of decent job at addressing this. But then it's created another problem, which I would call like impact washing, which is this idea that because you're exposed to green, you increase the number of wind farms or in the economy through your action. And so I think this is where the Commission developed the entire regulatory framework on the assumption that there's a kind of one-to-one translation between being exposed to green and adding green in the economy, which is like fundamentally inaccurate. And if you look at the, I think this creates a problem for the investors who want to have an impact. And according to our surveys, it's about like 15% who really only want to invest in that, and about like 45% who are interested to invest in that. And it's less than 1% of the products on the market that actually address their expectations. But when you look at the funds, ESG funds or green funds, about like I think 40% of ESG funds make like impact claims, and it jumps to 2/3 or even like 55% when it comes to green funds. And in kind of 99% of the cases, the funds we reviewed, there were no evidence to back those claims, and they were misleading or false in most of the cases. And I think the Commission actually increased this problem with the regulation, and we saw that since the introduction of SFDR, with like many fund managers promoting our Article 9 funds like as impact vehicles, even if there's no evidence that they actually deliver impact on this. So yeah, I think this is one of the biggest concerns I have right now with this with the regulation.
Thank you. Gianluca, I just want to, just a quick comment, if you will, because we have 3 more topics to cover.
Yeah, super quick. I just wanted to echo Stan. We need to know also that the impact assessment is very often made by small companies that pop out of nowhere, that approach the market, that it is desperate need because of the regulation pressure that Stan referred to before. And so basically they buy external services to just to understand where they're impacting. And these impacts basically sometimes are totally ephemeral, and they need to be reassessed more and more times. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, come back to the topic of expectations and what is reality, what is possible, and what we need people to be focused on. So lots of questions to be asked, and additional, and as you rightly said, the mismatch with products, which hopefully over time will improve along with the impact measurement. So. I'd like to move on now, just so again, looking at regulation, if you will, and I don't know if this is necessarily, I guess this obviously can be regulated, but one of the challenges, of course, is the lack of common definitions around sustainable finance. What is a sustainable investment? What does a transition mean? What is ESG integration, and the like? So I guess the question there would be, and I'd be happy to hear from any of the panelists, do you think, does the lack of definitions increasing? I guess we probably know the answer to this one. The lack of definition does increase potentially the risk of greenwashing. of obviously somebody not buying something that they think it's one thing and it's something else. But maybe Jarkko, if I could start with you, do you support the goal of converging towards a more unified language by, defining terms such as impact investing or ethical investing or even ESG?
Absolutely, I think it would be great to have more clarity and more convergence, but it's a fine balance. Because it cannot happen via regulation. We've seen what happens with e-regulation. We have the eco label doesn't fly. Taxonomy is not realistic. I mean, taxonomy alignment is not going to tell you anything about the greenness or sustainability of a product for many years, because it's not built for this world. It's unrealistic goals at this stage. I mean, very good purpose, very good ideas. We all want to do this. We all want to make good, but with all the best intentions, the EU regulation tends to lead to things that actually are not working that well in reality. So I think it's a fine balance. I would want to have more clarity, but if we have regulation and ESMA delivers level 2, it's not going to work. I'm sorry to say that, but it's going to be too high a bar. So we need something that actually works, and of course avoids greenwashing. Nobody wants to tarnish the market with any case of greenwashing. I mean that has to be clear for everybody. So we need more convergence on what is meant with what people are talking about. But clearly, writing EU rules on this, it's just not going to work. I mean, evidence tells us that very clearly. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else?
Maybe I can just add like a couple of words. I think we need definitions, but I think it depends from whose perspective. And I think we don't need definitions from the perspective of the asset managers. We need definitions from the perspective of the consumers, which, as I mentioned before, don't necessarily converge. And I think one of the difficulties is that the asset managers historically in Europe, they develop ESG products for institutional investors with the core objective of managing ESG risk to increase returns. And for most consumers, that's not the focus. The focus is more on impact or kind of the warm glow related to not investing in dirty. And so I think it would be easy, not too difficult to explain the product with the consumer's concept. But do we need the other way around? I think it's a dead end, and trying to educate consumers on concepts that actually don't make any sense for them, or for most of them, is probably something that is not really like a goal that will be successfully implemented and is worth pursuing in the first place.
Oh, thank you. Do you think some of these definitions will, there'll be their agreement as to what this terminology means? Do you think it will kind of come with time, if you will, general consensus as to what it means if we say impact investing?
So I
positive
think,
impact.
to a certain extent, yes, and I think that's already what we're seeing, even if it's not like kind of mainstream. But like we saw that in Tobias' survey, there's some awareness on the concept. But I think the other aspect is like regulators tend to think in terms of like how the products were distributed in like 20 years ago with like kids that you read and stuff like that. I think like by the time we solve this problem, you will probably have something where you actually like everything goes through algorithm, and you try like you kind of express what you think, what you like to your phone, and an algorithm will process what products should be actually designed for you. And my understanding is technologically this is something that is like possible now, very far from being implemented mainstream, but by the time we solve all those problems we are discussing, this will probably the way most retail investors invest anyway. So yeah, somehow I think we're trying to fix horse carriages at the time where the car will is about to become the main vehicle.
Thanks, Dan. Harold?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, that's well said, Stan. Also, I agree with this. I think it's very difficult to really sort of capture the essence of impact investing or sustainable finance in a definition that everyone's going to agree on. I think the simple reason is that people have very different sort of motivations deep down as to why they want to get involved in these things. And it's actually, I did a post on, I listened to a podcast once, and it was, they were talking about alchemy. And I thought it was very interesting. This guy, I forget who it was, but it's talking about alchemists. So in the Middle Ages, you had people who tried to turn lead into gold, and they were called alchemists. And obviously, as we now know, there wasn't really a point, because you can't turn lead into gold, but they didn't know that yet back then. But so what this guy basically said is that the point of being an alchemist wasn't really the idea of getting gold. So that's obviously what we assume now is, you assume, oh, these people wanted to become really rich and get lots of gold. The point was really just to demonstrate that you were pure of heart, or sort of pure of intentions. And I thought that was really striking, because obviously often when you see proposed definitions of impact investing, there's a lot of emphasis on this concept of intentionality. And I've always wondered, where does this come from? Because intentionality is just so difficult to capture or to demonstrate, but also at the end of the day, it shouldn't really matter that much, if you have good intentions, or the intention, really shouldn't it matter more that whether or not you actually are trying to solve a problem, or you're actually solving a problem. And also it's linked to this idea of, if you want to finance solutions to problems, you shouldn't care too much what the intentions are of the person actually giving you the money. So if you can find a pension fund willing to invest 100 million in your impact project, you should be very happy. But in the impact world, people then have this requirement. It's no, they can only do this if they have the intention to generate impact. Anyway, just a very long story perhaps, but I think that issues like that and elements like that, I think you have to put those on the table if you're trying to figure out, can you define impact investing or sustainable finance?
More complicated and personal. Bianca or Gianluca, is there anything you wanted to add in terms of common definitions, and whether that we need to regulate that, or if it's achievable or not via regulation?
Yeah, I can jump on this one, and I actually agree with what was said. It looks like everybody agrees with everybody more or less on this. It's not always like that, but no, I think that it's very important to, when we think about green, to know what we mean by green. Otherwise, we can't know, is this green or is this greenwashing? So I think, of course, it's important to have definitions. It's important to have comparable metrics, methods to measure different, to disclose issues, and not having that makes it difficult for consumers, very complex, also makes it difficult for financial education to help consumers at the same time. But my view is that we can't wait until we have agreement on all these issues, because it might take a long time. And in the meantime, consumers are exposed to various risks that we've mentioned also before. And I think, especially in this case, we have to deal with what we have, and financial education programs can have an important role to play here, especially given this complexity, the lack of definitions, and they maybe can have a role to play in actually making consumers aware of these complexities and of these issues, and help them navigate this field. So we know that consumers are interested already. So I think, to answer your question, yes, I think a definition would be very helpful, but we can't wait with financial education programs, at least until we have that. So we have to deal with the complexity that we have right now, and make sure that consumers are able to unpack these issues.
Thank you, Bianca.
Yes, and I have one more thing to again to echo Harald and Stan. I'm afraid that the search for the philosopher's stone that Harald was referring to before in The Alchemist, which is a very nice concept, intentionality versus impact. I would like to say something about that, but this thing very much clashes with what Stan was saying before about the algorithms that very likely in a new digitalized world will define what is good for us before we even know it. It's the predictive algorithm, it's the way they work. And the Moore's law, I think, it's the one that says that every 2 years there's the doubling of the chip capacity. So, I mean, we're going in that direction, and very soon the thing is going to happen. Now, having said that, I have one example that somehow I found useful for myself to understand the concept of intentionality versus impact. And it's about the catalytic exhaust pipes 30 years ago, roughly. When scientists and engineers came to us to tell us that they resolved the problem of pollution in the cities, they offered us this incredible tool that is the catalytic exhaust pipe. Only 30 years later, we know that these tools are killing us because they emit PM.2, 2.5 and PM10. And these things are killing us, and we know it only today. So on the perspective of an investment, intentionality is in that direction, but the impact would have been totally different. That's it.
All right, thank you. It's complicated. I'd like to move on, if I could, to asking you about a labeling system, whether, from a regulatory point of view, creating a labeling system would make sense. I mean, the EU legislation, it doesn't include a label. SFDR is Article 8 and Article 9 are actually not labels. They're, it's all about disclosure. But although many people, sometimes people use them as labels, that's for sure. And that can be a source of confusion as well. And as you may know, the FCA, the financial regulator in the UK, just issued, I think it was last week, their intent to propose 3 sustainable investment product labels. They are sustainable focus, sustainable improvers, and sustainable impact. I think the survey that we showed a little bit earlier shows that creating labels could be part of the solution to overcome the lack of sustainable finance literacy. And if I could start with you, Gianluca, as you are a member of the board of the EU Eco Label, and based on the work for the EU Eco Label, do you think that introducing labels in the in the EU legislation would facilitate communication with consumers and help advisors and distributors with their sustainability preference discussions?
First, I need to bring justice to Jarkko's words before, when he said that the eco label is still there and we're waiting to have a more clarified legislative and regulatory scenario before eco label steps into new definitions. First, let me say that I strongly believe that labels are unique in guaranteeing quality and expected outcomes, and also in targeting the right products for a vast population of investors. And I think that this is even more pivotal in early stages of awareness of transitional paths, such as the one we're going through now. But at the same time, I sense that in the complexity we all try to express today, and the complexity of wording as well that we don't like, I sense that this would have some sort of an impact, of some sort of backlash, similar to the label you have on food products. Take, for instance, a product that is labeled as biodynamic. How many people do know what biodynamic means when they're buying a cake wrapped in plastic, for instance? Very few. So the same, I sense, it would happen for investment products that will be provided of a label that, yes, will discern that product from all the others because it has some certain guarantees behind it. But the way it works, it's not going to become something in the pocket that will go in the pockets of those who will buy that product. So yes, we need the labels today because we are an ignorant species and we need to evolve in that direction. But on the other side, I believe that when people are aware of what's going on, labels are not to be used anymore because people know what they're doing with it.
Thank you, Gianluca. Jarkko, any comment?
I said before, I mean, yeah, I'm skeptical. Would be basically a great idea, fully agree with Gianluca, but the reality, as we've seen, is that in the EU, we are setting the bar too high, so it's not realistic. It's not something that can be used at this stage. So I mean, hopefully it will evolve over time, but clearly, you know, would be useful, but you know, in reality, can't see that happening.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I'll jump in here also. Even though, yeah, as said earlier, it seems increasingly like the mutual admiration society here in the in this panel, since we're all agreeing with each other all the time. But so I'm also skeptical about labels. Maybe useful just to mention something that I find useful often in conversations like this. This is what I call the distinction between labeling and enabling. What I see is that there's a great tendency in conversations like this to immediately start talking about, can we have a label for something? And I think often people skip this question. It's like, okay, well, why would a label actually be useful? So if you want to answer that question, you have to think about, like, what are you actually trying to enable? And so if you have clarity on the enabling, then you can have a conversation about the labeling. And I think that's a step that too often is skipped. And it doesn't apply only to labels, but it applies basically to any kind of sort of, you know, quantification or measurement or classification. And so there's, in the world of ESG, sustainable finance, there tends to be a lot of this sort of stuff where immediately people say, okay, well, we have to start by measuring this, because unless we measure it, we won't know what to do. And then the measuring or the metric or the label actually becomes the whole point of the exercise. So I think we should turn this around and first think about the enabling side of things. Then we can figure out if we can come up with a label that really captures what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. Stan?
Yes, so I think a couple of things on the eco label. So I think the Commission really approached the topic with the wrong definition, and what they tried to do at the beginning was like inconsistent with the European regulation actually. So we put research in the public domain on that, and I think it kind of shifted a little bit the dynamic. In terms of just the concept of a label, I think the idea of a label is like you have product on shelf, you have consumers that have like similar expectations, and so you need to put a label on the product. I think if you distribute things with, so you assume that you need a score that is useful for more than just one person, but multiple people, and they want the same score. I think this is not necessarily a constraint that you have if you distribute products through digital means, because you can have a score that is custom for each person based on their own preferences. And then you only need data points for each product that can be processed for each individual customer. And so we see that happening on many products. And so I think nobody will read a kid on a piece of paper anymore in the future. And my understanding is just, yeah, the concept of label doesn't really apply to the way people compare financial products these days.
Okay, so not conclusive on labels, although there are still obviously discussions underway, I think, and as we saw for the FCA, they're definitely calling what they've come out with, proposing labels, which is quite interesting. So I think obviously this is an area we'll probably see developed. We don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to, and we did actually, the last topic is on the role of advice, which we've actually covered quite a lot during the panel. But I did just want to ask a few questions, remaining questions, if you will. I mean, maybe Harold, do you think MiFID could be effective if people aren't financially literate and don't understand what's expected of them and all the terminology? I mean, an advisor can, you know, be as smart as possible on sustainable finance, if you will, but if the investor isn't financially literate, will it work?
Right. Yeah. So it's, well, I think you probably know my answer. And also in the chat, I posted a link to an article that I wrote with Florian Heep, who was also at the University of Zurich at that time, has since moved on to MIT. But so the title of the article is MIFID Misses Mark, Motivations Matter. And so I think that probably tells you everything. So it's all about investor motivations. Is kind of what we've been discussing here. And as Stan has said, often the motivation is to do with impact and or causality or sort of, additionality. And the MIFID rules basically completely miss this point. And they basically say, financial advisors have to ask consumers or the clients about their preferences. Preferences says nothing about what their underlying expectations are, as you've also pointed out various times. And so it seems to me that the MiFID regulation is going to be very ineffective. What's also making this more difficult is that we were talking earlier about using simple language and, Yip and Janneke language, as I said, sort of, children's language almost. The MiFID requirements basically link to other European regulation, like the taxonomy and SFDR and all that sort of thing. Those are things that, as we've been discussing, are just incredibly difficult for financial advisors to understand, let alone the clients that they have to ask these questions of. So I'm very skeptical about the whole MiFID initiative on ESG, to be frank.
Okay, maybe changing course slightly, Bianca. Could the OECD, together with the European Commission, for instance, organize training courses about ESG for financial advisors as retail investors, or is this just something that's best left to other organizations?
Yeah, so we don't organize normally, or we don't provide programs for end users. Typically, we are more focused on policy research and advice. So we have plans for this in particular. But what we did do was to work with the European Commission on developing a core competencies framework for adults on financial literacy, which also includes sustainability issues. And in this framework, actually, we looked at sustainability, the sustainable finance, let's say, in broader terms than just investments. So for us, sustainable choices also relate to ways the consumers choose their products in the supermarkets, their food, their clothes, the importance of understanding that savings products have different sustainability characteristics, same as as investments, insurance, retirement products. We also include competencies related to identifying risks, including climate-related risk, and how to take insurance around this issue. So we look at a variety of competencies that people should have in order to understand sustainability-related issues, and we are basically hoping that this framework and these core competencies are going to be used by market players, by regulatory authorities, by policymakers in the countries to develop financial education programs that address these issues and that address these various core competencies in a way that is also targeted to the individual consumers. Because as I said previously, financial education cannot just be standardized. We have to look at what are the target groups. We have to look at what are the delivery mechanisms and what are the countries, the country or the market characteristics. So we hope that by providing the general underlying core competencies that consumers should have in this regard, then financial education programs could be built on it to address the needs of the consumers. And maybe on a positive note, I also of course heard a discussion of and the proposal from my colleagues on the panel today that also policymakers should be get trainings on these issues. I have to say that from our side, of course, we work a lot with policymakers, and we have recently created a working group under the OECD INFE, which is the International Network on Financial Education, on sustainable finance and financial literacy, which and this working group is likely to undertake more work to understand these issues in detail, to collect data, and to maybe inform more guidance on how to tackle these issues of financial education programs in relation to sustainable finance. So this is what we can do, not direct programs for the, but I think also the part of providing some more guidance could be helpful, and for others to basically put in practice the programs.
Great, good to hear. Thank you. That's very encouraging. And maybe just one last point on the role of advice. Jarkko, of course, as you'll know, asset managers have been providing investor education to financial advisors and training to financial advisors for a long time, if you will. And given that twin challenge of financial literacy or financial education and sustainable finance education, do you think that's an area that asset managers are, combining the two, is that an area where asset managers are now focusing more of their efforts on?
Absolutely, and that's where this whole thing lives or dies. I mean, advisory process is key to everything. In addition to, as I mentioned, we are the biggest bank in the Nordics. We are the biggest distributor. We have thousands of advisors, millions of customers. We've been asking sustainability preference question already for 4 years. So we've done this before, and depending on client segment, it's been like 50-60% lately. I mean, the way people reply as positively to these questions. So it's been rising the whole time. People are more interested in these issues. Now with all this MiFID stuff, obviously we have to train our advisors, to ask these MiFID questions, try to simplify it, try to somehow operationalize it. And I think the jury is out. What's going to be? I very much liked Harald's comments on that. I'm not sure MiFID is helping here, but we have to, of course, implement it, and hopefully that won't that much damage the process in the advisory field. So key is to have trade advisors, and their asset managers, of course, have to work together with their distributors. That's absolutely key area. Yep.
Okay, so for the asset managers in the audience today, you hear that message. You need to step up your efforts on not just on the financial education and information about products, but also on the sustainable finance elements of it. Explain what you're doing as well. So we have reached the end, but I would like to, and it was a fruitful discussion, even if there wasn't a lot of arguing. These are difficult issues to discuss in any case, so in some respects it's good, but there were slightly different views, so that was good. But I'd like to ask each of the panelists just to highlight in 1 minute sort of the 2 most promising measures in your view that can help retail investors understand what sustainable investments are and ensure that they're offered ESG products that meet their preferences. That might be a tough one. And then finally, again, with the goal of making them more inclined to invest altogether. So Bianca, perhaps we could start with you.
Okay, very shortly, I think we all highlighted the different challenges in this discussion today, and my one take of this, or my recommendation would be to really try to keep a little bit, even if it's hard, a positive message about these issues when we talk to consumers, while of course warning them about the risks and the potential risks of sustainable finance, because I think we all need this. And yes, I agree with what Harald was saying before, that most likely the investment of, we don't know, but the investment of the retail investors are not going to be enough to avoid the catastrophe we're heading towards too. But I think we need everybody on board to get this done. So I think try to keep the positive message around these issues. It will be important for me. There's no other way than sustainable. Then keeping this in mind and try to work all together. So that's my take.
Thanks, Bianca. Gianluca?
Permit me to say, Denise, that the fact that everybody agrees that the regulator should be trained, it's a slap on the face of someone somehow. So we're saying something a little bit disruptive in some ways. It's not a mild panel in this terms. I'd like to say, man, if there's something I could suggest to an asset manager is simplification, but we said it in all the possible ways. And while they simplify the messages visually and in terms of content, they should lobby a little bit on the restructuring of the schooling programs, because in that way, in a mild industrial round of 5 to 7 years, they might have an army of clients that are more ready than our generation has been.
Thank you very much. Stan?
Yeah, so I was happy to agree, because I grow white hair here, disagreeing on this topic with everybody and their brother for years. So that was a relief. I think in terms of like next step, and where I see a kind of promising path is could be either like, I think a public or a private initiative is like turn the elicitation of like social and environmental goals and preferences, and delivering impact into a form of entertainment for like individual investors. So as you can see, I live in the US, and I saw like the rise of like retail investors going on platforms, cryptocurrencies, voting apps, and this type of stuff, which is not specifically focused on sustainability, but where you actually attract new people with gamification. So I think it creates a lot of risk from a consumer protection perspective, but there's also a lot of new technologies that, if they are well regulated and managed, can create this emotional connection that is missing, I think, today with most products like ETFs, and this ability to build your own like path to impact, be more active. And so I think technologies are ready, and I think the risks are manageable, and there's an interesting path here, even if it's not necessarily an easy one.
Thank you. Mirko?
As the advisory process is key, so that needs to be the focus. The other point, the more public debate we have on these issues, the better. I mean, we tend to be in the bubble of specialists in these green issues, ESG issues. Now, I think we're going to have a new kind of lawyers in EU, like ESG lawyers. It's a new kind of law even. So how to get this debate public, so that the regular people are engaged in this dialogue. I think social media, any sort of, that kind of new media are useful and should be used to have proper information dispersed in member states. The public debate, I think, is the only one that actually can, in the short term, really like get people more engaged, have better understanding, get them at least make the right questions when they go and invest, as they distribute their asset manager the right questions. I mean, that's already a beginning for them to understand what is happening.
Thank you, Jarkko. And last but not least, Harold.
Thanks. Yeah, I like Jarkko's and Stan's. I mean, everyone has good ideas. I think especially on Jarkko and Stan's, I like those in particular. And my tool can maybe also help there, because what I would recommend is that we use more storytelling and analogies or metaphors in these conversations. I always like using the metaphor of the vacuum cleaner. And so if you can think of, SDGs and ESG and all that sort of thing as the idea of, we need to clean up the world. And so you could think it's like, oh, hey, we should get everyone to buy a vacuum cleaner. And so first of all, you have to think about the question, okay, well, that sounds like a good idea, but how much is that going to help in terms of actually cleaning up the world? But so even if we agree that that can, make a contribution, you have to think about sort of, how do you then sell vacuum cleaners to consumers? And you have to be clear on what those things actually do. And so what we're seeing now, I think, often with sustainable funds is like you have people selling vacuum cleaners that don't actually clean, they don't actually suck air, but they make you feel like you're cleaning. You walk around the house with a machine that doesn't do anything, or you have machines that promote cleaning or sucking air, but don't actually do that. Anyway, so obviously the analogy is to demonstrate that when people buy a vacuum cleaner, they want to know that it actually works. So analogies like that, I think, can be a fun way and an educational way to drive these points home.
Oh, that's a great way to end. Thank you very much. Well, you've done my job for me in concluding. So all that's left for me to do is to thank the fantastic panelists and for sharing your experience and your insights and your candor, to help us see how we could meet that challenge for the next challenge for investor education, which is here today, sustainable finance literacy. And thanks again to you all.
Thank you.
Hand it back to you,
It's a
Natalie.
great debate.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. That was such a rich panel discussion, and I would like to thank all panelists for this outstanding contribution, and also especially to Denise for such an outstanding chairmanship. I'm so glad that this webinar has been recorded, so we can listen to it again and continue to learn from the very rich contributions that you made throughout the last 1.5 hours. And dear audience, rest assured that EFAMA will remain active in this area, and we will be doing more events and more publications on this field of not just financial education, but sustainable financial education. And we hope to engage with IOSCO and to continue to support IOSCO and their initiatives, work together with OECD, with Bianca, work together with the European level institutions to help shape and improve all the big aspects that we've just discussed right now, and to help deliver on the green agenda, the social goals. And with that, I'd like to thank once again the excellent panelists, the chair of the panel, and the 2 presenters we had at the start. And I wish everyone an excellent evening. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye.